Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Ottawa Business Insights presented by the Ottawa Board of Trade. My name is Su-Ling Ching, and it is my pleasure to be the President and CEO of the Ottawa Board of Trade. We're thrilled to be here this afternoon with a fantastic keynote by Abacus Data's David Coletto, Public Opinion and COVID-19. I'd like to start by saying thank you to our member businesses who are supportive of our policy and programs, starting with the Ottawa Citizen, Enbridge, as well as Tiger Lily Marketing. So thank you to those members who make it possible for us to bring these events to you. And of course, today to our presenting sponsor, Abacus Data. As you know, the Ottawa Board of Trade mission is to create community prosperity through leadership, collaboration, and advocacy. We do this by tactically supporting businesses in their growth and success by offering many membership benefits and programs. As well, we work closely with our economic partners and decision makers at the local, provincial, and federal level to make sure that we have a competitive business environment, as well as promoting Ottawa as a global iconic city, a great place to live, work, and play. During these past several weeks during COVID-19, we have definitely scaled up a lot of this work in an attempt to ensure that we are able to support businesses through the peak of this pandemic, as well as work closely with all of the stakeholders to ensure that we have a successful recovery. So we are very excited today to bring to you a local expert on what has been going on in the public with the COVID, and we were really thrilled to have David Coletto work with some of our committees as we work through this and present here to you today. David is the CEO and founding partner of Abacus Data, a full-service market research and strategy firm that is based in Ottawa. He has several years of experience in this industry, and he and his partners founded Abacus Data 10 years ago, and in fact, they're just celebrating their 10th anniversary, and it has grown into one of Canada's most respected research firms, market research firms. He's worked with a large range of organizations, including Shaw Communication, Canadian Bankers Association, the Bank of Canada, Food and Consumer Products Canada, the CBC, Canadian Pharmacists Association. The list is long, David, so I might leave the rest of your bio for them to read on our website. But he is one of Canada's leading experts on generational change and millennials, and he is regularly invited to speak to groups across Canada. David is a foodie, a gentle explorer, and a political junkie who loves exploring why people think and act the way they do. And I just want to say an extra thank you to David because he's also the mastermind behind the Ottawa Growth Survey, which we've been running in collaboration with his company over this last 8 years, and looking forward to releasing this year's results as well. David's earned a PhD in political science from the University of Calgary in 2010 and has a BPA PM and an MA from Carleton University. And he is also an adjunct professor at Carleton University. We've been so looking forward to hearing from David and his insights. Welcome, David Coletto, to the Ottawa Board of Trade.
Well, thanks, Sue-Lynn and Lynn for organizing this, and to welcome everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. I know it's been a very challenging and uncertain number of months, and I feel much of the same, I think, that everybody else is feeling, in that we're now in a new stage of this, and the level of uncertainty is shifting a little bit away from the health consequences of this pandemic, and a real focus going to be on the economic. And we're going to hear from the Minister of Finance today about the impact it's had on the fiscal situation with the federal government. But what I want to do today is give you a sense of some of the research that we've done over the last number of months, exploring how Canadians are responding to the pandemic. And I think as business leaders in the community, as association heads, as anyone who has a real stake in figuring out how to move forward, I do think obviously that data and market research can help inform that, and understanding sort of the headspace of your customers, of your employees, of stakeholders helps you, I think, clarify a little bit what has been a really murky and challenging period to just make sense of what's going on. So I'm going to jump right into it, and we'll have some time at the end. If you've got any questions, you can use the Q&A function on the Zoom call. My plan today is to share some data. I've got lots of it, and I couldn't pack it all into the 40 so minutes I'm hoping to take up today. But what I think is the most important data for you to think about. And we've explored broad public perceptions, and we're going to get a little bit into some of the specifics around different sectors, just to give you a flavor of some of the research we've done, how customers and consumers are feeling about getting back into doing more of the things they did before, what the consequences of these last 16 or 14 weeks have been. And most important is to get you thinking about what you should bet on, and what does the data tell us, and how has it evolved over time as we start to make decisions and really make consumers and employees more comfortable coming back out and doing the things that they were doing before this all started. Now, we've gone through many phases of this crisis from different vantage points. You know, the provincial government has their own terminology to describe things. But as I look at it from a public lens, it's now obvious that we've been in phase 3 now for a number of weeks. You know, we went through that reaction phase where this was all sudden and shocking, and we had to make sense of it all, and both from our personal lives as well as our professional ones. We moved into a phase before the reopening started, in which we were really coping with the lockdown or isolation that this new life created. And as governments, both here in Ontario and Quebec and elsewhere, started to allow some of the restrictions to be lifted, we moved into this third phase. And this third phase will last, I think, for quite a while, until really we have a vaccine or a real effective treatment for the virus, or for COVID-19. And that's when we'll enter that final phase, which everyone uses the term the new normal. So this reset phase is so important, because it's not back to normal. There's still the risk of the virus. And as I'll show you, Canadians are well aware of that risk of a second spike. They're well aware that the virus is still out there, and it is having a substantial and real effect on the choices they're making, on the considerations they're making. And I'll give you some examples around tourism and travel, given that we're in the summer, as an example of how that's working. In my mind, I think when we think about, you know, what's the lasting legacy beyond the severe economic impact, the health consequences, beyond those, you know, important changes that this pandemic has brought along, I think what it's done at the very least is accelerated many of the trends we've seen in the consumer and in the marketplace, whether that's the consumer market or the labor market. And you know, we do a lot of research on generational change, on technological change, and how that's impacting consumer and employee behavior. And what we've seen is, what I've seen in the data and what I've expected is, we've seen an acceleration towards a more digital first experience, whether that's how we interact with government, how we interact with businesses, how we shop, how we make decisions, how we consume information. We were already seeing a trend in that direction, but I think it's accelerated and expanded to a larger audience. We've seen a move to more flexible work. We've had to. If you work in an office, then you can work from home. Home is where you've been working now for quite a number of weeks, if you aren't an essential business that your office can open. For others, it's meant, you know, trying to figure out, how do you change the way you work? And so we had seen before a growing demand among some employees and workers for a more flexible work arrangement, some hesitation, some resistance from employers to move in that direction. But I do think we've seen a much more openness to that. And I think the demand for it, as I'll show you in a minute, will persist long after this pandemic is over. And then the last thing that's important, particularly from a retail or hospitality or food service perspective, is, you know, for 15, 16 weeks now, we've been formally more or less hunkered down at home. And that home-based experience is not something that's brand new. We've been trending that way for a while with the growth of, for example, streaming services, and how we get our movies and content. More and more of what we were doing in our lives was happening at home. For example, I worked I've met a few times with the Red Blacks or other professional sports teams, and getting them to think about how difficult it's been convincing people to leave their homes Friday or Saturday to go out and spend money at a game is becoming harder when we can entertain ourselves much more at home than we ever used to. So that home-based experience is something that's accelerated. And so as we look ahead, the two questions that I've always been asking my clients and those that I've been presenting to think about is, we've heard that term maybe too much, what will that new normal look like? But that new normal, I think when we first started this pandemic, we didn't think it would maybe last as long as it has. No one really expected it to be at the stage we are now and how disruptive it's been. But as business leaders, I think about it in my own case, what's the right bet to make? Where is the puck going, so to speak? And I think the data I'm about to show you gives us some insight into that. I want to start, though, with a broad understanding of where Canadians are. And we've been tracking on an ongoing basis. You can see on this chart, that bottom, all those dates. That's how many surveys we've done looking at COVID-19 and how Canadians are responding to it. So we've done, in almost every instance, at least 1,500 to 2,000 interviews every few weeks. So we've got a good data set. We're about to go in the field next week with our next one, our first one in July. But what this number on your screen shows is the percentage of Canadians who say they are either extremely worried or worried a lot about coronavirus or COVID-19 at the moment we ask them. And this is those who have an extreme level of concern, right? Canadians, generally speaking, are engaged on this issue. They're concerned about it. But this is that group who are most worried. And you can see that it has evolved over time. And it hit a peak around 40% in March and April. And it's come back down, but it's again plateaued around 1 out of 4 Canadians who say they're worried a lot about this virus. So despite what seems like in Ottawa and most parts of the country, the spread of the virus has gotten under control, there's still many people who are deeply concerned about it, and that's affecting the choices that they're making. Another question we ask is, over time, over the last few days, have you become more worried or less worried about the pandemic or about the virus? And you can see that we saw a big shift in April. But over the last few months or last few weeks, we've seen about equal numbers saying they're getting more worried than as they are getting less worried. And we now have for 2 waves in a row, a sizable number more saying I'm getting less worried. So we're moving into that next phase, which is why I think as things reopen, as people start to realize that the risk might be starting to dissipate a little bit, that worry about its consequences aren't developing. But what worry means is something that's important to understand. In the early days of this pandemic, the concern was primarily focused on 2 things. Will I or people I love get this virus? And 2, can our health system manage a potential wave of cases? We've now moved much more into a world where we're worried about still getting the virus and that fear of a second spike and having to repeat this whole thing over again. But the economic impact is much more in people's focus these days, and understanding how it's going to affect their own personal financial situation, how it's going to affect the broader economy, what it's going to mean for government finances and programs and all that is starting to make more sense. And as I said, today's fiscal update from Minister Morneau will be further fuel in that debate, in that discussion. But it's important to keep in mind that despite the fact that we seemingly have the spread of the virus under control, most people still believe there is a risk of getting this virus, right? Only 12% of Canadians, similar number in Ontario, say there's a small or no risk of contracting the virus. In fact, a third believe there's still a high risk of infection. So if you still believe that, it's going to again have an impact on what you're comfortable doing, on the choices you're making, and the importance for both businesses that face consumers, if you're retail, if you are a restaurant, hospitality, tourism, but also employers in making employees feel comfortable coming back to the office when eventually that's going to be allowed to happen, or in the current context, coming to the workplace at all. Managing that perceived risk is particularly important. If we look across the province, I'm not able to often break out Ottawa specific in my data, but I am in some cases able to look at Eastern Ontario as a region. What we find is actually the perception around the risk of infection doesn't vary all that much across the province. It doesn't vary all that much by age group. Younger Canadians, younger Ontarians are just as likely to perceive the risk high. Now, if you're younger, the vulnerability and the severity of that virus, if you were to get it, is perceived to be less, but the risk of spreading it, the risk of getting it, is still as high as it is among older Canadians or Ontarians. But the thing that I've been focusing for the last few weeks on, and we've seen evidence now in the United States that's overwhelming and kind of shocking, and that has shocked us into realizing that we're still at risk. And so that risk of a second spike continues to go up. It's why, for example, 87% of Canadians are opposed to reopening the Canada-US border anytime soon, right? There's a deep fear that if we open that border, Americans are going to come up and that virus is going to spread. So our mind is still very defensive, and we are thinking about, most of us anyways, the decisions and the behaviors we are making and how we can limit the potential spread. Now, I'm focused primarily on what the general public is thinking. Certainly, as I talk about the financial impact, there's plenty of evidence and data to show how bad things have gotten. The unemployment rate, the highest in the G7 here in Canada, 13.5%. The number of businesses that have been severely affected, all of that's clear. And when we ask Canadians, to what extent has this pandemic hurt your financial situation, you can see what I'm calling two Canadas, really, where you've got about half or just under half saying it's had a great deal or moderate harm to their financial situation, where the rest say not that much or not at all. And when you look at what's important about this recession, is who's it's affecting, right? There's evidence that suggests, and our survey shows it, those in more precarious work positions, those female, younger employees who typically work in the kinds of environments that have been shut down. Think of, the entertainment industries, hospitality, food service, tourism. They have been most affected. And so that's where the impact has been most felt. On the other hand, and this is strange as it might seem to be talking about opportunities during this period, there are some Canadians, and I think probably more so in Ottawa than other parts of the country, given the strength of public sector employment here in the capital, is that you actually have about 1 out of 5 Canadians saying, at the end of the month, I'm actually have more money available to me than I usually do. Now, 40% say less, and so that's the recession, and that's the real constraint on spending and consumption. But there's 18% out there who actually have more money, whether it's because they've had not had their kids in childcare, and so they're saving $2,000-$3,000 a month, whether it's because they aren't spending as much as they would on some travel or other kinds of discretionary spending. And so I just hear anecdotally, how hard it is to get a pool guy or gal to come to your house in Ottawa this year. How many people are installing pools as a reflection of, first, behavioral change, that people aren't looking to venture outside their homes, so they're looking to install entertainment and comforts at home. So that's that home-based trend I was talking about. But for some, they have extra money and they're going to be spending it on these kinds of things. So there is a segment of the market that has more money, that is looking to be entertained and to find some delight in their lives. And I think if I look at some of the successful cases, even in the restaurant industry, like Becta and some of the more higher end restaurants who've adapted their business, they've been quite successful, and there's an audience and a market for that. So I think there is opportunities here if you can think about how to reach your audience. But there's still no doubt that the economic impact is there. This is the trend line for those who say they're really or somewhat worried about the long-term financial situation. It's down a little from the end of April, but not really. I think the normal number here is more around 30%, so it's still elevated to where it would normally be on any given day. One out of four Canadians, still worry that their job will disappear. That's extremely high number. So even if they have been displaced or furloughed, they're worried that job will disappear for good. If they haven't lost their job yet, there's still deep concern about it. And I know concerns about the wage subsidy and all these government programs eventually stepping away or changing is putting further pressure on people. And we've seen in some other data a slow rise in consumer confidence, but it's still way lower than it was before all this started. So consumers are going to feel more and more comfortable spending. The housing market appears to be doing okay, but that's likely the result of a lack of supply as opposed to a lot of buyers out there really wanting to get into it. Very quickly, just on leadership, because one of the, if there is a bright spot in all of this, one of them seems to be that Canadians as a whole, even Ontarians, are feeling much better about their political institutions than they were at the start of this. One of the strange findings is that more Canadians believe the country's headed in the right direction today than at the beginning of all of this, an 8-point increase over that period. So if I had told you that we have a substantial recession, that we're in the midst of a global pandemic, and more people think the country is headed in the right direction now than they did before it all started, you'd say, David, that's nuts. But I think it's a reflection of, first, how we compare ourselves, which we always do, to the United States and the big mess that we believe is going on down there, and how relatively well, and I'm taking the politics out of this a little bit, you feel that our governments, whether federal, provincial, municipal, have handled this crisis. And there's some comfort that Canadians have that government could have done more. They could have done some things differently, but generally speaking, they're doing okay. And when we ask about government approval overall, not just on the pandemic, you can see, that the federal government, and this is federal government approval, coming into this, had more people having a negative view than positive, but that's substantially changed. And so the federal government right now has an approval rating as high as it's ever really had. And I think and we see that with Doug Ford in Ontario. We see it also to some extent with Mayor Watson and City Council today, even though before all of this, there was lots of doubts about the mayor and the transit system not working and some frustrations. I think this crisis has put a new lens on how people are approaching government. I want to shift gears now and spend a lot more time talking about behavior, particularly consumer behavior in a post-COVID world. And that post-COVID world is going to probably be a ways away. So that behavior and how we're thinking today is really important, obviously, for figuring everything out. And I start with this picture that came out about 2 weeks ago of a theater in Germany that they had set up that would be appropriate for the distancing required to hold an indoor concert. And when I first saw it, and I don't know if any of you had seen it, it was really, gut-wrenching in a way. It felt wrong. It felt like a place I wouldn't want to go. And even if I'd want to see the concert or I enjoy or miss live performances, that it just was a reflection of the times. And I think as businesses of all types start to, we're opening up, we're trying to get both our employees and team members and our customers to feel comfortable again. It's a really difficult task. I was in Muskoka last week on a vacation, and my wife and I stayed at a hotel, and everything there was good, and they made it feel really comfortable. But we decided one afternoon to just go to the town main street and just walk around. And all the stores were open, but there was this really awkward feeling about going in and out of a store because of all the rules, because of the fear of getting in somebody's way, that you can't just browse, right? And so this is the challenge that a lot of retailers are facing, is the real benefit of going to a bricks and mortar store as opposed to shopping online is that joy or that process of discovery. How do you recreate that in a world where we're very apprehensive about exploring, about trying new things? And I think this picture reflects that. But as we've seen even in the last few days, and that we've noticed it in a lot of the research we've been doing, is that behaviors, and this is not new, this has always been the case, can shift very quickly. And on the question, and I'll come back to the question of masks in a moment, because I know that's been a very recent number. But at the end of June, we asked Canadians, which of these two perspectives do you most prefer when it comes to reopening the economy? Do you want governments to go slow and err on the side of caution, given that there may still be a risk of a second spike or more infection? Or do you think that because we've controlled the spread, it's now time to reopen the economy? And the fact that you've got 3/4 of people siding with the go slow approach is, I think, all you need to know to understand just how apprehensive consumers are about getting back out there. And I experienced it firsthand. I wanted my parents, so I live in Ottawa. My parents live just north of Toronto. I wanted them to come up to Muskoka. I hadn't seen them in person in 16 weeks now. And I thought we could create a safe space. We could come, we could be together a little bit. And at first they said yes, but by the end of the week, before we were about to go, they decided they're not coming because they're in their 60s. They feel at risk. They didn't want to expose themselves, and they just weren't ready to come back out. And that wasn't a big, ask of them. And I understood why they didn't want to, but it was reflective of me and confirmed a lot of the data that I was seeing. On the question of masks, and I know for some it's a controversial thing, we just released some data that from a survey we did at the end of June that asked Canadians some questions around masks in public spaces. And the first one is, most Canadians are wearing a mask of some sort. You've got almost half who say they're almost always wearing one. Another quarter or so who say they wear it at least half or less than half the time. Now, 1 out of 4 Canadians admit they don't ever wear a mask right now. But the thing that's fascinating as a social researcher is how quickly the adoption of masks had come even before they were made mandatory by a number of jurisdictions. So that if we go back to our first survey in March, when this first started, and at the time, remember, even Theresa Tam, the Canada's public health doctor, was saying, masks may not work, and so there wasn't a real push to wear them. Only 13% of Canadians were saying they were wearing masks. Now we've got, almost half who are saying, or more than half saying they're almost always wearing one. When we look at it across the country, Ontario actually is the most likely to say they're always or almost always wearing masks relative to other parts of the country. So the shift to going mandatory here in Ottawa or Toronto or other regions of the province is not a substantial shift. Most people were already wearing masks when they go into public places. We see much lower incidence in the prairies and in Atlantic Canada. But when we ask people, if governments decide to make mask wearing mandatory, and we asked this question before Toronto decided to do this, I think Ottawa had announced it, but it hadn't yet come into place, you find almost universal either support or, as we say in our business, acquiescence, acceptance of this. To the point now where only about 14% of Canadians oppose mandatory mask wearing, 9% in Ontario. So this is a signal that while nobody loves to wear a mask, no one wants to wear a mask, that it's accepted. And I think having now a standardized rule that forces it on everybody is going to create an a level playing field that is going to take away the social pressure and the anxiety or the awkwardness that comes with those who wear one and those who don't, and how do we react, removes any of that tension that might exist. And I actually think for a lot of businesses makes it easier because you now don't have to enforce something or do something that's different than some of your competitors or colleagues. Everybody's on the same page when it comes to masks. And so the mask question is, again, further evidence of the challenge and the reluctance that so many people are feeling. We did a big survey for a number of regional tourism operators in Ontario on the impact that the pandemic is having on tourism. We did the survey in June, and I'm just going to share a little bit of the data because I think tourism, particularly in the summer months, is a really important, not only for Ottawa's economy, but an important example of the push and pull of the pandemic is having on people's behavior. And what we learned was that, and this was a survey of Ontario travelers, so those who in the last 2 years have traveled more than 40 kilometers for a leisure or recreational type trip, so not for business. And when we asked them, when it comes to returning to travel, are you going to be somebody who jumps back in, tests the waters first, or gets back in carefully? And what you see is that almost all travelers in the province are going to have some caution in how they get back to doing it, right? The choices they make are going to be careful. And I think in my own trip last week, it was deliberate after I unpack it as a researcher. And why did I go to, the Muskokas? Well, I grew up there as a kid having a cottage. Why did we stay in a certain hotel? Well, we stayed in that hotel chain before. There's a lot of familiarity about the choices that we make. And I think this is reflective of across the consumer markets about the choices people are making. They're going to probably be biased towards the familiar, and trying new things is going to be harder to do in this environment than it was in the past. Now, the great opportunity for Ottawa and for the National Capital Region is that hyper-local tourism is likely going to be the thing for the next 12 to 18 months. When we ask travelers, will you feel comfortable in the next 6 months traveling internationally, traveling to the United States, even traveling to another province, you can see, big majorities internationally into the US and just a slight majority to another province say, I'm not comfortable doing that. So these are people who might naturally want to travel internationally or go to the US who are saying, it's off. And I'm going to be much more likely within a very short period of time to feel comfortable exploring my local community, doing things around town that I'm able to do. And so that creates, I think, an opportunity for that local experience. Just some other data here. What we ask people is, what did you do last year? And what are you planning to do this year? And the first point is that tourism is going to be down this year. That's not surprising. But it's what they did last year. So 75% of travelers in our survey did a day trip last year. This year, 65% think they're going to do it. So the gap is about 10 points. Overnight trips, 13 points lower. Week or more long trips this summer, 12 points lower. So across the board, we see about a 10 to 13 point drop in intended travel behaviors this year. But you see that day trips and even to some extent overnight are still going to be the primary source. Now, what's clear, and if you didn't think about this already, you probably are well aware, 2020 is going to be the year of the road trip. Very few people are feeling comfortable. This is the percentage who say they feel comfortable traveling to a destination in a plane, on a train, or in their car. You can see the overwhelming comfort. And while not everybody's always comfortable flying or taking a train, these numbers are much lower than we would normally see. So that resistance to stay, to go away, and that incentive to stay local is deep. But the questions that, and the factors that matter in our survey, I think can be applied to other parts of other sectors. So these were the questions and the factors that were important for travelers in deciding what and where they might go this summer. So this is on their minds. Will I need to self-isolate after I go to this destination or when I return? Can I distance myself from others? And the choices about what they do, they're very focused on having clear information about what is it going to be like when I arrive there. What are the protocols in place to protect me and my loved ones from others in a way. That clarity of communications, it was almost universal that people said, I want to know what are different businesses that I'm going to interact with doing to keep me safe, to keep other people safe. And for travel, not surprising, how easy it is to get home if I had to. If there was an outbreak, if something happened, God forbid, could I get home easily? So these were factors that were affecting travelers, but the same issues, I think, also are affecting other customers in other areas. And one of the things we're monitoring closely is that comfort level. I've been saying for a number of weeks now, just because I can do something doesn't mean I will. Just because you say I can get a haircut, just because you say I can have a drink on a patio, Doug Ford, doesn't mean I'm going to feel comfortable doing it. So how do you create that comfort level? And so we've been tracking, May and June so far. We'll do it again in July, how people feel about doing these different types of activities. So this is the percentage of people who say they are completely or mostly comfortable doing these things. And this is nationally, but the results really don't differ in Ontario, or even if we were to have large enough samples in Eastern Ontario. So you can see very few people feel completely comfortable flying on a plane or going to a music festival or even going to a sit-down restaurant. In fact, some of these numbers are going down from May to June, then going up, meaning comfort levels aren't increasing yet, right? Staying at a hotel, bringing even a child to a playground, which are still closed, mind you, there's not a lot of comfort in doing that. In fact, when we look at the other side of it and say, what percentage of consumers say they are not comfortable at all doing these things, you can see, again, flying on a plane, going to a music festival, very high numbers there, substantial resistance to even shopping at a mall. 29% of Canadians said that they're not at all comfortable doing that, staying at a hotel. So all of this indicates still a level of hesitation, discomfort that exists that isn't yet dissipating. And in fact, the fear is, and the worry will be, that if concern about a second spike grows, if news comes out about small outbreaks here and there, that's going to again force people to close down and go back into their homes. About a month and a half ago now, so this data is not super fresh, but I don't think it fundamentally changed. We asked people, under what conditions might you go back to doing some of the things you were doing that you may not be allowed to do right now? And we asked, for example, what would it take for people to go back and shop in a mall? And on the left-hand side here, you see that about a quarter of people are saying, I'm not going to be comfortable until there's a vaccine. Now, that may not be the actual number who resist going to a mall completely, but as an indication of that's the worst case scenario. So 26% are completely writing off a mall, they say, until there's a vaccine. On the other hand, 7% said, I'm ready to go now. I don't need anything. But as you can expect, this was before masks were made mandatory, and I think the demand for masks has grown, that these are all things you'd expect, right? Clean surface, for the rest who have conditions, clean surfaces regularly, give me enough room to distance, reduce the number of people. Majority say those are conditions by which will make me feel comfortable coming back. Trust in an organization. I've been telling everybody who will listen to me that we've entered an era now where your reputation, it's always mattered to why people, interact with you, do business with you. But I think it will matter even more. And as much as your reputation was built on perhaps other factors, quality of service, quality of products, customer service, how well you delight your customers, the sense of loyalty, their safety now in a larger range of organizations and businesses is going to matter even more. And so thinking about how do you manage your reputation and how do you leverage that if you have a good one, or if you don't have as good a one as you should, how do you instill and build one is, I think, going to be critically important. The other thing that the pandemic has done is, as I said, accelerated many of the trends we were seeing. If we use grocery shopping as an example, this was a survey we did in May or in early May, where we asked people, have you done the following? Have you having groceries delivered to your house from a grocery chain? Have you had groceries delivered from Amazon? Have you subscribed to a home meal kit service like Good Food or HelloFresh? And this was back in May. These were much higher numbers than we had seen before the pandemic. And so one of the questions that lingers in my mind as you try to think about the path ahead and how do you evolve and pivot your businesses to this new reality is to also recognize that for the past 16 weeks, many consumers have been introduced to new competition, new alternatives for their time, for their money. And grocery is just one example of it, that if you have spent the last 16 weeks getting your groceries delivered to your home, there's a good chance you're going to continue to do it well past needing it, because it's become convenient. It's become interesting, or not interesting, or useful. And the same is true for online shopping and the growth of digital and e-commerce. So all of these are indicators that some of these changes are happening. The last point I want to make and focus on is a little bit of the workplace itself. And we did some research with GWL Realty Advisors about a few weeks ago, and we asked working Canadians who work in offices, and we're focused mainly on offices because other workplaces have come back, and safety concerns are still great. But as we move to maybe phase 3 and offices start to reopen, one of the lingering questions I'm always asked with is, are people going to want to work in an office again, whether from an employer's perspective or from the employee's perspective? And the first question that we always ask is, have we been more productive or less productive at home? And so when we ask those who have worked from home that normally work in an office, whether they feel they've been more productive or less productive, you actually get a split down the middle. You get about equal numbers saying I've been more productive, 42%, less productive, 40%, and about 15% who say they about the same. And when you unpack that, not surprising, a number of factors matter. So if you have kids at home, you're more likely to say you've been less productive than more productive. If you are somebody who's younger, who may already have had a proclivity to work from home, can use technology maybe a little more seamlessly, you're more likely to say you've been more productive. But what's important here is, at least from the perspective of the pandemic, is that this perception of productivity isn't strong one way or the other. And it's really in the eye of the beholder. And that's, to me, a signal that not all employees are the same, as we all know. So when we ask people after the pandemic, what would you prefer to do? We basically get another split, although the tendency is for more people to want at least some ability to work at home. 1 out of 4 Canadian office workers say, I want to work at home full-time. Brit stop. I like it. It works for me. And I've had no problems with it. Another third say, I'd like to work from home a few days a week. I'd like that flexibility built in to my work schedule. On the flip side, about 22% say, I want to go back to the office full time. These are people who typically have young children. They don't have long commutes, so that's not an issue for them. And they feel that they're far less productive at home than they would be at the office. For the rest, the tendency is more flexibility. I may not want to go a few times a week, but I'd like the idea that every now and then I can work from home because I've realized it can work some of the time. And so all of this, I think, points to a complicated choice as employers and businesses, associations, nonprofits, you name it, start thinking about, what do I do with my workplace? In my own case, I have a team of 5 here in Ottawa. We've got 2 employees in Toronto, and I share an office with another 10 employees. We have a great, cool space in downtown Ottawa that we have not stepped foot in 15 weeks. You know, the question we've asked ourselves is, do we need a space? Now, we've come to the conclusion that yes, we need a physical space. We need a place to meet, but we're likely going to move forward, even after the pandemic, to a much more flexible environment. And it's one in which, in the research we've done with millennials and young employees, they've always asked for, and a lot of employers have been resistant about. I do think we're going to come into a world where the demand for as big a physical footprint is not as great. On the flip side, in this transitionary period, it's ironic that, you know, the shift to a 2.0 workplace of open concept and cramming as many people into as small square footage as you can is likely going to not be acceptable in an environment where we're trying to distance ourselves from other people. So this transition period remains important. And I've heard from multiple sources that, you know, for example, the government of Canada is basically saying that for the next 18 to 20 months, the default is going to be work from home, and it's likely going to be that way going forward. So, you know, commercial real estate and changes in that space, I think, are going to be profound and real, as we've seen, and everybody uses this example of Shopify. Last slide. When we ask Canadians who are employed, you know, what's going to make it comfortable for you to come back to the office? What's interesting is there's less resistance about going back to an office than there is about going to a mall, for example. And I think the fundamental reason is at the core of what people are looking for, whether I go to a mall, whether it's I go to a restaurant, whether it's I go back to my office to work, is, do I have control over my space? Can I control that? And if I can, I'm going to feel much more comfortable doing it. And so creating a workplace that people feel in control of, that they have their own space, that they can clean it, that other people won't invade their space and potentially infect it, are going to make people feel comfortable. And having clear policies that everybody buys into with strict, penalties if people don't follow them is going to create the environment of accountability and trust that I think you're going to need as you reopen these offices going forward. So to wrap up then, this slide was just a way that I visualize how to think about like post-COVID behaviors and recognizing that health considerations, the reputation of the provider, the creation of new habits. Again, habits form in like 20 to 60 days. We've been doing certain things now for far longer than that. And so to expect us to just revert back to normal or how we were before the pandemic, I think is going to be difficult to happen. And so we need to operate in a way in this new world where certain behaviors are going to be the normal, and we got to get people to go back to what they used to do. So to wrap up, what should you bet on? Well, the first thing is we still don't know a lot about how long this pandemic will go on, about how long it's going to take till we get a vaccine. And we are getting every day more and more insight into the depth and length of this economic deterioration. But what we don't know is how the public policy levers and solutions that governments have used up till now, how long will those go on and how long can they go on? But what we do know is that as a result of, I think, further division between different households about where you work, how you work, some are better off, a lot are worse off, as well as new interests and habits that have formed over the last 15 or 16 weeks, I think is going to create some long-term behavioral change. Unfortunately, for some sectors, it is going to be harder to get people to come out and spend money, in part because they haven't done it. And the more I think about how hard it is to get people to change behavior, well, our behaviors have changed. And so now you have to revert back, as I said, and that's going to be more difficult. But in the meantime, in this period where this virus is still a risk and that people perceive it to still be a risk, the goal is really creating a space, whether that's a store, a workplace, a hotel, whatever your place of business is, that closes the gap between what people feel comfortable doing and what they are able to do. And to me, that is the hard work of creating that confidence and getting people to come back out again. What is also important to keep in mind, I think, is that we need to throw out many of the assumptions and learnings that we had about the world, whether that's the consumer, the customer, the employee, and relearn some of those things. Because I do think that the factors, the drivers that affect our behaviors, why we do what we do, is not fundamentally changed. There's still instincts, we're still, human behavior is still there. But this overlay of this pandemic has caused people to reconsider a lot of what they held dear and important and what's valuable. And understanding that and getting to the root of that, I think, makes for better decisions going forward. So, Sue-Lin, I will end there. I know I've captured a lot, but I appreciate everybody's time, and I'm happy to take any questions. And if you have to get in touch, here's how to do it. And I'm happy to chat with folks in Ottawa always.
Thank you so much, David. That was fascinating, and I love the insights that you shared. We do have a couple of questions. I guess Minister Manohar has just announced that the government projects a $343 billion deficit, a federal debt climb to $1 trillion. At what point might this statistic start impacting favorable polls, or will it impact the polls, or do these figures, take a backseat to how lucky we are to be living in Canada?
A good question, Ian. I don't know yet. I think, the way that I would, if I was trying to predict how Canadians are going to react to this economic news, the first thing is to recognize that no one blames, I think, the Liberals for the pandemic and for the need to spend all of this money. In some other research we've done in the past on this question, majority of Canadians say spend whatever you need to spend to get us through this. And so the government seems to have spent whatever it believes it needed to spend, and may need to spend more. I do think, though, that the challenging part of all of this, as much as this pandemic has been very difficult for everybody, in a way, it's been relatively easy from a public policy perspective because there has been no limits on what government can do, right? And people are willing to follow along leaders during a crisis. But the real challenge now is the choices that government's going to have to make to get back to a more sustainable fiscal situation. You know, we've done a little bit of polling. There's not a lot of appetite for, you know, significant tax increases. There's almost no appetite for increasing the HST, for example. No appetite for, personal income tax increases. More appetite, which is always the case, as you all know, for corporate tax increases or wealth tax. If I don't have to pay it, of course I'm going to support it. That's usually the case. But the politically sensitive stuff comes where there's some cuts that might need to be made. And I'm not sure how the government's going to approach that. At the end of the day, if they continue to communicate a clear motivation to do well for Canadians, to do right by them, they should be able to sustain it. But I suspect the debate will only ramp up, and we haven't really had a debate yet about the fiscal situation. Today may have been the start of that, but I don't really know whether it's going to have a long-term impact on their popularity. But every government of all political stripes is now going to face the fiscal crisis that they've created to stop the health crisis and the economic one.
Thank you. There's a question here around sending children to school in September. Have you done any research about that? And we'd be interested in knowing if you haven't, if you intend to, because that's high on our agenda as well.
Yeah, I'm speaking actually with an organization that I think we may do some stuff. We haven't done it on September. Back in April, when, for example, Quebec was starting to reopen some schools, we did ask some questions on a national survey. We interviewed 500 Canadian parents. At the time, there was a lot of resistance and hesitation to sending their kids back to school. So if I'm going to skip ahead forward and say, well, in September, if nothing's really changed in terms of the risk of the virus, and schools are not put in a position that that the perception is their kids are safe, I think parents will be very resistant to send back their kids. There was I don't know if you've read it. Lauren, I forget her last name, Lauren Hughes, I think, wrote a really good op-ed in the Globe and Mail last week that made a very compelling case for the importance of reopening schools and investing the money to do it safely. I think that debate is going to ramp up. It's already started. But I think if the status quo is where we're at, I think there'll be a lot of parents who will feel very reluctant to send their kids back. And that will create strains on employer-employee relationships, I think, as we try to manage that.
Yeah, for sure. There was one question about your surveys and how they're conducted and the number of people you survey and the representation in the community.
Sure. So these are surveys done of all the data you saw in this presentation came from a number of surveys we've done over the last few weeks. We interviewed at least 1,500 Canadians, representative sample by age, gender, region, official language, and education. So these would be the same methodology we use in election or polling that we do on politics. We had a really great record in the last election, one of the most accurate polling firms. So it's a scientific representative survey. We don't have large enough samples for Ottawa, for example, that I feel comfortable sharing that specific data, but this is reflective of, I'm confident of what Canadians are thinking, and we can drill down to Ontario level stuff too, pretty confidently.
That's fantastic. So David, thank you so much for this information and the way that you've interpreted it. One of the questions I had on my agenda was how can we as community developers and the government decision makers inspire more confidence among consumers, and you definitely answered that. And as you probably know, we were supporters of the public health decision to make masks mandatory, not just because we believe in their decision that it reduces the risk of transmission, but that it also is a means, as you said, to inspire confidence and to equal the playing field. And then some of the other conditions that you had named here, we feel are addressed by making the Post Promise, which is a campaign that we're running with other national associations, asking businesses to go on to postpromise.ca, and it gives them just some very basic ways to give the consumer and their workforce this confidence that they've reopened safely and that they're able to declare that. So we really do promote anything businesses can do to make the community feel confident, but it's really everybody's game. And so consumers as well need to make decisions on how to support our local economy by wearing masks, by shopping local. And I just wanted to just take 1 minute to promote our local United Way, who has brought in an inventory of masks for sale, and all of the proceeds from those masks are going toward donating masks for those who are in need and most vulnerable. And so I encourage everyone who's on the call today to take a look at that as well. David, we are very grateful to have your expertise in our local economy, and we look forward to working with you again in the future. And I just wanted to just say thank you again to the Ottawa Citizen, to Enbridge, as well as Tiger Lily Marketing for making today possible, and to Abacus Data for making today's presentation possible. We look forward to seeing everyone again soon. Be safe, be kind, and be prosperous.
Thanks,
Bye, everyone. Thank you.